Good morning and welcome to another episode of CoachesCorner.health. If you're new to our channel, welcome. And if you're a veteran and have been listening for a while, welcome back. Today, we're going to be diving into equality for women in business and why women may be treated differently than men in the workplace and business in general. Despite significant progress towards gender equality in the workplace over the past few decades, women still face the significant barriers and biases that prevent them from achieving full equality with their male counterparts. Women continue to be underrepresented in leadership positions, face pay disparities, and often encounter discrimination and harassment in the workplace. There are numerous factors that contribute to these persistent inequities, including cultural stereotypes, unconscious biases, and structural barriers such as inflexible work schedules and inadequate parental leave policies. These factors can have a significant impact on the professional and personal lives of women and hindering their advancement, undermining their self confidence, and limiting their opportunities for success. So please join us today as we dive into this issue a little further and try to answer some questions like: are there reasons women should be treated differently? Are we slow to change policies? What are some of the ways we still treat women as less than men? And why and what are some of the things we can do to change this? Hi, I'm Leslie Godet, and I'm a self-care specialist for busy female entrepreneurs, teaching them how to make self-care their number one priority to support them in life and business. Andy, tell us who you are.
Thank you, Leslie. I love your introductions every time. Hello, everybody. I'm Andy Lidstone. I'm the unconditional coach. I help people with boundaries and control issues. Um, we're talking today about a wonderful topic. I love this one because it's something that's been near and dear to my heart for years. As my mom tried to have different careers, as my sister has tried to have different careers, and of course, as the ladies in my life, the other ladies in my life have tried to have different careers as well, and I've noticed a significant difference in how they're treated, especially if they don't go into traditional female roles. If they just if they try and do the same jobs that men are doing, or the same, or run the same kinds of companies the way men do, there's a significant difference in how they're treated, how they're paid. So this is a significant, an important topic for me. Thank you. So let's start, as we have been recently, with your experiences. Tell me about what this has been like for you in your career, because you've had a lengthy career. So tell me about it.
Yeah, so I think first of all, I went into, I would say probably female, it felt like it was female dominated being in the support staff. I only really and even today have only really seen pockets of men in the industry like myself as the support staff. Typically men are in different types of industries, a lot of them leading teams. Whereas in, like, especially in law, I've found there are some legal assistants or paralegals who are men, but it's mostly been women that I've found, and that's just been my own experience. Um, I've found that, I guess, it really, there has been times where maybe the stereotype of women serving, men leading, or men in charge, women in the service part of business. That's probably what I've, for the most part, for the past 40 years of being in this industry. Although the last 5 years has really been, as again, no longer in that particular role, because I don't go to a traditional office. I work from home, so I work for myself. So I don't really see that as much anymore. But I think, as while I was going through working, I did find that there was a lot of there were differences in the workplace and how men were treated as opposed to how women were treated. And I'm talking about, let's talk about that in the leadership positions, such as the senior staff, the lawyers, and watching how um, the gender, the way that women were treated if they had a specific personality trait that wasn't favorably looked upon, whereas you saw the male lawyers and the male attorneys who would be exhibiting behavior that to me was really unacceptable. And yet I found it was less for them to be called on. They weren't necessarily especially if they were in the senior leadership positions, senior attorneys, senior partners, for example, and they had bad behavior. I didn't see that there was a lot of change in even when like workplace harassment legislation was brought on, into most businesses. I didn't really find that they were being held accountable for some of their actions. So
Right.
yeah, it's still, I think, a big work in progress.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting that you say like the part where well, first of all, you mentioned that you've gone into a primarily female dominated role within the companies that you've worked for. Yet the senior positions, if they're held by women, the same characteristics, same traits that are acceptable in men have been less acceptable in women. Especially those toxic or dominant traits or dominating traits that are you know frowned upon. They seem to be more frowned upon in women than they are in men. So men can get away with being harassing people, and they can get away with being a little more toxic than women can in the same position. That's interesting that you say that, because that's been my experience also. Not as my own in my own career, but in the careers of people around me and the different companies that I've worked for. If I've had female bosses or female managers, um, I found my colleagues and coworkers treating the female bosses and managers differently than the male ones, simply because they were women. The same. If a coworker or even myself needed to be reprimanded for something, or needed to be have some corrective action taken, or even if the person was just having a bad day, um, those characteristics, those traits that we find in that we find acceptable, or at least tolerable in men, we will call women on that every day, every time. If a woman's having a bad day and she says something mean to a customer or to a coworker or to a subordinate, that'll get reported just about every time. But if a man is in the same situation and has the same reaction, it's much less common for somebody to say something about that, right? And even it's less common for women to say something about it when men do that, let alone if a woman is reporting another woman. I mean, it doesn't matter who is on the other side of the conversation. It's just the female managers and the female bosses tend to get called on having bad personality traits or having a bad day much quicker than the men. So I appreciate that you brought that forward, because that's been my experience also. I've also seen that you know um, women have to be a lot more careful about how they address people, especially when they're in positions of authority. Um,
Yeah, what I've found too is just being a woman in general. I think women are less tolerant of other women uh, being aggressive in those positions, and they'll tolerate men more in those positions in with bad behavior. And so how do we change that, right? So, Andy, are you still there? Are you still with us? All right, so I'm not sure. I think Andy's having some technical difficulties, but he'll be back. So yeah, I think for me personally that uh, my own experience with women, a lot of the time, in the very beginning when I started out as a legal assistant, and then, eventually along the years, into paralegal role, is that I found that I was less tolerant to women. I was less tolerable to women in being their, aggressive, like showing those aggressive traits that men typically would exhibit, and being less forgiving of women. It's like I held women to a higher standard, and yet when it came to men, if I was treated badly, it was almost like there was this. double standard that even as a woman I was allowing myself to fall into that trap of, well, saying that, well, men are allowed to act this way but women are not. And this is coming from me being a woman myself, of actually holding women in a different to a different standard. And so it's, I think this is also part of the conversation, and one of the questions that, as women we need to start asking ourselves. Because if as I was saying in the intro, that when there's, women in leadership roles, and men in leadership roles, if we're not going to hold them to the same standards, then what is it, how are we really creating that, how are we creating, uh, how are we allowing women to grow into these positions if we're holding them to a standard that we're not holding men to? And I think that's something that as women we need to actually ask ourselves those questions, like, why do we do this? Like, why are we treating each other differently and holding ourselves to a different standard when it comes to being in business or in leadership roles? So, yeah. How are you doing, Andy?
Yeah, I agree. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I'm having some
I
connection
can hear
issues.
you.
I'm sorry.
No, that's
Yeah,
okay.
I agree. It's just it's uh it's unfortunate when with the way we treat women differently, especially showrunners, bosses and you know business owners and entrepreneurs. Not just as employees, but as vendors and customers and clients. We tend to approach women entrepreneurs and women business owners differently as well, and that's also unfortunate, right? I don't think that's also something that I want to be seeing in how I'm doing business. So it is quite unfortunate when I see that. But at the same time, what can we do about it, right? So this is a topic that I try hard to address when I'm talking to people, when I'm talking to different men and different women in business. I'm trying to address it differently also.
Yeah, I agree with you too.
Um,
But we know it comes from, like, being, when we look at the history of women in business, we've talked about this before. Really, you could say for, let's just say for the last half of the 20th century, we're now like 23 years in, almost 23 years, we're in the 23rd year of the 21st century. But for the last half of the century of the 20th century, you found women now starting to go out into the workforce, but and trying to carve a path, trying to to make themselves known, to be seen as important, to be seen as, uh, deserving to be sitting at the same table. And
right,
it's really been a man's perspective for such a long time, because women didn't really fit into those roles. Women were the caregivers, men were the gatherers, women were the caregivers, and so they stayed at home.
right,
And you've heard people say things like, you know being at home in the kitchen, taking care of the family, taking care of the children, making sure that the house runs smoothly, and that's a business of its own. But I think
yes,
what I think what happens is that now that women have started, women started carving their own path from, let's just say, like I said, the last half of the 20th century, so 1950 and forward. And even then, it was 1950 really still was so much about women being the caregiver, the home person, the person that stayed at home taking care of the family. Like, it was frowned upon. And then women started, like, getting into the 60s, and all of the different movements, and women deciding to, like, get out and start into the workforce. And then it became a necessity as time went over, time went by for women to actually work, because there were a lot of single family parents, single family homes, and women having to actually be the provider, the nurturer and the provider. And then, of course, in families where the parents were together, they still needed two incomes. So there you go from one extreme that has been like for centuries been the norm to then changing really only in the last 70 years, 73 years of women, or not even, let's just say, let's call it an even 60. Last 60 years, women really starting to carve their own way, with getting into the workforce and then starting to have their own businesses, like really pushing forward and trying to like fit in and be worthy to sit at the table. And now I think women are starting to say, you know what, I am deserving to be at the same table. I'm worthy to be in the same room. But it's how do we change the narrative for the outside looking in, because I can feel confidence to say I belong at the same table, I deserve to be in the same room as everyone else, as men are in the industry that I'm in, which is coaching. Being a life coach, there's a lot of great life coaches who are female, and there's a lot of great life coaches who are men. But
Yeah.
I think what's the way we need to start changing the narrative on the outside, like the world looking in, because it's the world that's creating this narrative. And it might not be necessarily sitting at the same table as 10 people, and half are women and half are men, and they all are in agreement that they all deserve to be sitting there. It's really like the perspective of the world, like looking at the past, centuries old, way of doing things, and how do we change that narrative, because that's where change is going to become. That's changing that narrative is where then change can start happening within companies, and creating those leadership roles where uh, there's not that held to a different standard, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And when we change the narrative, when you're talking about that, we're talking about how we talk about, how we communicate with women in business, women in the workforce, not just women in female roles or women in power roles, but men and women in all roles, in all parts of work and business. Whether they're choosing the male dominated roles, or whether they're choosing female dominated roles, or whether they're choosing something that is neither or, right? It's how we talk about them, how we pay them, how we treat them, the kind of respect we give them, what we expect of them. Those are all part of the conversation. And I think a lot of the time we misunderstand or minimize the impact that our opinions have in this particular subject. Um, I think we believe that if I think one way and everybody else thinks another way, that's okay. Or if some of us think one way and some of us thinks another way, that's okay. And as a life coach, as life coaches for both of us, I think in most areas of life that's true. That we do encourage people to have different opinions on things and to act in their own authenticity. And this is one of those subjects where I think that still is causing more harm than good in this arena of how we talk to women, how we treat women, and how we talk to each other about women in business. Um, Even if I were to sit down and have a few beers with the boys and be talking about a female coworker, that conversation is different than if I was talking about a male coworker. We say different things, we notice different things, we comment about different things, and that is where the conversation starts. If I'm sitting down talking to my significant other about a female coworker versus a male coworker, conversation is different. It goes right to the core of our relationships. I have clients, male clients, whose girlfriends or whose partners have they have a significant issue if their male partner is working with a female. Whereas if they're working with men all day long, they don't have a problem with it. So just these core conversations that we're having, they heavily influence how we treat women in business, how we treat women as entrepreneurs, as business owners, how we treat women professionally. These core conversations we're having personally in our own personal lives, they have major impacts on how we see women and how we treat women professionally. So if we're going to change this conversation, I think it needs to start right at the core of our conversations, of our personal and intimate conversations with the people that are close to us. Right? I think that's where it starts.
Yeah, absolutely. It does start at just even with our friends, with our family, and how we treat each other, uh, especially based on gender. Because if we're going to change the narrative in the outside world, which is what I believe, the outside world is what is creating this, I guess, gap between men and women and how we're viewed, how we are, like pay inequalities, all of those types of things. Then we have to start at the table of our kids and our families, talking about how we treat each other, how we look at each other, looking up to someone, in our community who happens to be a woman, can be either frowned upon or it can be encouraged. It's being able to encourage our children to be able to go out into the world saying, okay, we're not equal when it comes to strength, when it comes to physical strength, excuse me, obviously, because we're built differently, and that is okay.
Right.
Now you can go so far as to say, well, then what about bodybuilders? And that's a different animal to
Right.
itself. But typically men and women are not built the same, and that is okay. I think that's awesome. I don't want to look like a man, and I don't think, and if I want to have a relationship with a man, which of course I'm married now for 27 years, and you are in a relationship with a woman. We don't want to look like our significant other. We want to look like ourselves. There's
Correct.
that attraction to the opposite sex. That's great. But on top of that, what we want to be able to encourage is allowing ourselves to believe that it's okay for our opposite sex to be as successful in business as we are, based on our, let's talk about intellectual traits. And intellectually,
Yeah.
that's really where it comes down to, because it takes, you have to be open-minded. I would say growth mindset, rather than fixed mindset.
Yes.
Being open to listen to other people, being able to be in the same room with someone who's different than you are, and engaging in conversations, whether you're a male or whether you're a female, and being able to
Correct.
take that and say, okay, I can respect this person based on what they are bringing to the table, based on how they think, how they are emotionally wired, how they think about things, how they care about the people in their lives, and looking at it from that perspective, rather than, oh, she's a woman who's emotional, who, it's all
Right.
about, this, or he's a man, he's aggressive, and it's all about this. It's taking away those stereotypes and just allowing us to be men and women in business, men and women who are entrepreneurial, and looking at it from that way. And but it has to start, I believe, like what you said, it has to start at home, because those are the people that we're raising our children to believe one way or another. We're raising our children to believe
Yeah.
either that the woman is the caregiver and the man is the provider, and that those roles, even though the woman may work as well as the man, that equally together, they they do life, they make decisions together, they talk to each other, they're equally important, their input is equally important. But it starts with us teaching our kids that, so when they go out into the world and they create businesses of their own, or they start working for other people, they learn to respect the person based on their characteristics, their values, rather than their gender. That's, I think, where it starts.
Uh, I agree. I agree. It starts with our children, and it does start with respecting them, each of them, for their value that they bring, intellectually or emotionally. Um, you know, there are, like as you mentioned, there are jobs where a person's physical attributes are important. There are plenty of trades where you need to have a certain level of physical strength, ability to throw around large, heavy things, or to carry around or maneuver large, heavy things. And in those cases, because of the physical differences in a man's body and a female body, I think it's okay, not necessarily right, but at least okay that there are going to be more men in those positions because more men are more likely to be physically capable of doing that. That's not to say that women shouldn't be in there, because I know plenty of women who are quite strong and quite physically capable who I would not want to meet in a dark alley somewhere. But the commonality is more amongst men than women, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
and I agree that in most jobs, the differences in men and women, the physical differences are less important. Because men and women have equal stamina as far as being able to work 8 hours or 12 hours or 16 hours a day. Men and women have equal emotional capabilities as far as emotional intelligence and emotional stamina. Men and women have equal capabilities of intelligence and intelligent conversations and being philosophical or analytical or all of those kinds of things. Men and women have equal opportunities at those kinds of things. It's there's not a significant difference in those kinds of attributes. So there isn't a reason why we shouldn't treat men and women similarly for those jobs that aren't primarily physical. And to go back to what I was saying a little bit ago, I think some of as you were talking, we want to treat women differently. We want to start with the children and teach our children to treat men and women as similarly as possible, not so much because they are the same, but specifically in professional environments, we want to teach our children that as a professional, as um, an employee or an employer or a boss or a service provider of some sort, the difference between men and women are minuscule, insignificant. Um, so teaching our children to interact with men and women the same, you know, when they go to a grocery store or when they go to the daycare or wherever our children go, showing them that men and women deserve to be treated equally is important. The the part that I wanted to call attention to, though, is it's all well and good to decide we want to treat men and women equally as professionals. The part I think where we miss out on that is when we get angry, when we get upset, when somebody does something we disagree with. This is where we were at the beginning of the conversation. If a boss does something inappropriate, a male boss will have different consequences than a female boss. But it goes the same way if we have coworkers um, or service providers or vendors or clients that act differently. When a bunch of guys are sitting around having beers after work, and a woman has acted inappropriately at work, our derogatory comments are going to take on a significantly different flavor than if one of our male coworkers acted inappropriately at work, whatever that inappropriateness is. Um, the way we get mad at people, the way we take our feelings out, the way we discuss our feelings and our emotions about men and women are different. And I think this is where the importance lies. This is where even when I'm angry at somebody, I try and be angry at men and women equally the same. If I'm disappointed by somebody's actions, it's not going to be because she's a woman or he's a man. It's I'm
Mm-hmm.
not disappointed by a woman's actions differently than I'm disappointed by a man's actions. If a man is yelling at somebody or a woman is yelling at somebody, I'm going to react similarly to both. If a man does some sort of sexual harassment, or a woman does some sort of sexual harassment, I'm going to react similarly to both. You know, or at least I'm going to try, because it's when we are upset at somebody, when we've had a negative interaction with somebody, that's when our real character comes out, who we actually are and who we actually think of these people. You know, when a female coworker sexually harasses a male coworker, and we dismiss it because all guys should like attention from women, that's not cool. Because
Mhm.
when if a man did that to a woman, it would be reported every day, or at least it should have been reported every day. But it's much less often reported when it's a woman, because we just judge that he should like that. That's not cool. It's the same no matter what. If a male coworker or a male boss, loses his cool and starts yelling at an employee, um, we just listen to it. We might be upset, we might be angry, but usually it's not reported. But if a female coworker or a female boss starts yelling at an employee, we definitely recognize that, and we have significant judgments about her character, and often that gets reported. Often because somebody says something to, HR or whatever other entity is involved. It's when we're upset. It's when we have those negative interactions. It's when things don't go the way we want them to, that I think we need to be careful about how we interact with men and women, because that's when our real opinion comes out. And that's what I think I want to pay attention to, and what I think our audience could afford to pay attention to. If we're going to change this conversation, if we're going to change how we treat men and women in business, it's going to be really, at our intimate conversations in family, and it's going to be also what we do, how we react when something negative happens, when there's a negative interaction. So that's
Yeah,
my thoughts.
one of our viewers has been writing, talking about the component of, you know, intelligence, like maybe not having a business, I guess, a business sense, and then feeling intimidated and threatened. And that, a lot of women feel that way, especially if you're going
Yes.
into a, a
Yes.
leadership role, if you're actually stepping outside of your comfort zone. And she talks about family. The family is rooted in the past, right? Again, and especially if you come from different backgrounds, like culturally, right? We've talked about cultural
Yeah.
differences on our channel before. And culturally, we know that our if you come from a different background, and even if you've grown up here, whether you're in Canada or the United States, and you are maybe second generation, you still have that generational background from your grandparents, from your parents and your grandparents, because things get passed down, right? And so you're trained
Yes.
to grow up a certain way. You're trained to, especially if it's a cultural, uh, a family rooted in culture. You're raised to believe that men are this and women are that. And how do we, change that narrative? Because I think that was one of that really is what the question is leading to. Also the tone of voice. Our listener also put on the talked about the tone of voice. You know, women, again, we are held to a different standard when we respond a certain way, because there's that emotional component. I've heard it said many times, oh, you're too emotional. Oh, you have to get a backbone.
Right.
I've heard that before. And of course, I knew that a lot of my responses to things were coming from an emotional place, and that was just because I had to do some inner work to get to the root of all of those things, of why I was feeling the way I
Mm-hmm.
was, which helped me to then be able to manage my emotions my way that felt good to me. But she makes a good point here, is that when women get angry about something, or they express themselves, they're expected to have a different tone of voice than men. Men can express
Yes.
themselves and have that authoritative tone of voice, and my way is the way to go. Whereas women have to
Right.
almost adopt this more gentler tone, this more gentler side,
Right.
and there's that double standard. So again, we get back to our questions of, this is a couple of ways that women are treated differently than men, especially in business, even as employees, but in life in general. And what can we do to change that? Because again, it does come, especially when it's cultural. How do we deal it? Because,
Yeah.
as we've talked about this, Andy, the melting pot, to cultural diversity, it's, in the United States, they want you to adapt. This is our culture.
Yes.
You have to be American. Whereas in Canada, it's like
Yes.
bring who you are, be who you are. But then
Yes.
there's, I think, still the underlying tones of be American, but make sure that, especially if you're a woman, that it has to be this way. Like, make sure that you understand, um, in other words, maybe understand your place. If I could even go
Yes.
so far as to say
Yes.
that, and
Yes.
as I said, I've been out of the workforce for an extremely long time, other than just in the role that I have now. So I'm not 100% sure what it feels like to be in an office setting. I haven't been in that place in a long time, but I think that's really what it is. It's women have to have a different tone of voice. They have to choose the words wisely. Men can just be off the cuff and say what they feel. I believe women and men equally should be able to say what they mean and mean what they say, but also the tone of voice does matter from each, not just one-sided.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the places we really need to start focusing on, is making change there.
Uh, I agree. And to your point exactly, um, you mentioned that you had to do some work to manage your reactions so that you weren't, coming from an emotional place. Um, I've never been accused of being too emotional.
Mm-hmm.
I've been accused of being aggressive or abusive or angry, but I've never had the words "you're being too emotional" used against me. Whereas that happens often to women, and it doesn't mean the same thing, right? When we say women are being too emotional, we're talking about angry, sad, crying, mad, grief. We're talking about all the whole range of emotions. The only emotion that people care about men doing is angry. If we're sad or we're grieving, or even especially if a man's crying, people don't call negatively to that in the professional workplace. They might say, suck it up a little bit, but they don't say, oh, you're just being emotional. So men are required to handle their emotions a lot less than women. I mean, the very fact that you had to do the work just to be heard, you had to work on your stabilizing your emotions just to be heard. This is something men have never had to do. I mean, that's a generalization and it's not entirely true. Men do have to work on their emotions to be heard, but not nearly to the level that a woman does. And this is the problem. This is part of the problem, is we hold men and women to a different standard. You know, I think it's important that we allow women to be angry just as much as we allow men to be angry. I've heard several women say that when they're growing up, they were not allowed to be angry. They were not allowed to have that negative lashing out emotion. I've heard several women say that actually the only emotions I was allowed to have are the soft ones, like crying or laughing or loving, but I was never allowed to be hard and angry. I've heard several women say that, and I've heard women who've been forced to be very hard and very angry against their nature, against who they really are. So, and the problem is, I know lots and lots of men, just virtually all of my male clients are forced to be hard and angry when that's not their nature, but nobody even recognizes that that's what's happening. Like none of them recognize that that's what's happening. But when a woman does that, it's called out 7 days, 7 ways from Sunday. Like it's all called out every time. So again, it's about how we approach the difference. The the other thing I wanted to bring attention to is there is a difference between the difference of a man and a woman in a family or in a personal relationship than what we're talking about. We're not talking about your personal relationships. Sometimes men and women choose different roles in their relationships and in their families. That's fine. If you want to come to an agreement on that, there's nothing wrong with that. Some people are a little more traditional in the family, and some people are a little more, you know, new age or left and right, or a little more liberal. That's fine. That's the choices each of you get to make within your own family. We're talking about a professional environment. We're talking about in business and in the workplace. So in business and in the workplace, I think it's very, very critical that we start treating women with the same level of not just respect, but even the disrespect. Even the times where we're angry at them, or we think they're acting badly, or whatever. I think even in those times, it's time we start treating men and women professionally as though they have equal consequences, they have equal rights, they have equal responsibilities. If it's not okay for a man to do something, it's not okay for a woman to do it. If it's not okay for a woman to do it, it shouldn't be okay for a man to do it. Right? And therefore we hold each other to a similar standard, not based on gender, but based on character flaws and characteristics, our character traits. That's what I think. What I want to, the world I want to see is a world where we're judged on our character traits, at least professionally. I am making a distinctive separation between personal and professional relationships here because, as I mentioned a minute ago, what some people prefer to be much more traditional in their personal relationships, and I support that for those who want it. I don't think everybody should do it, but I do that. I support that for people who want it. So there's a difference there.
Yeah, there's and we've talked about this is how we started our channel around expectations in relationships. And I think that
Yeah,
it does lend to professional. There's the expectation that even women in leadership roles, women who are in executive level, C level, suite level roles in businesses, there's still that expectation that they come from this, they choose their words wisely, they have a softer tone, they don't come across too aggressive, and that is an expectation. Then the man is,
yeah,
he has to be assertive, he has he's applauded for, like, breaking through the, I don't know, doing things traditionally that men would do to get ahead. And maybe it might be too considered aggressive by some standards, but that's an expectation, and that is usually rewarded with praise. Whereas women, if they step outside of that and they start to become more aggressive in the things that they do, maybe they're seen as too assertive or too aggressive, or their language is not acceptable. And it's the same language, the same way of acting, maybe the same words or similar, the same circumstances, but then they're not rewarded for that. They are reprimanded. So yeah,
yes,
in the professional world, I think we're starting to see, that's why I think we're starting to see a lot of women who are becoming very bold and in their entrepreneurial journeys, creating women owned, women led businesses with many women and staff. Their team members are women. And that's because we've started to recognize that, uh, this is the way we do business is different than the way men do business. And if we need to change the narrative, then we need to maybe start with ourselves and how we treat each other. Because again, there was that double standard myself. Like I said, through my career, I looked at women and I held them to a higher standard than men. And now I understand that it's really, that was just too much of a double standard rather than a higher standard. And learning to understand that that's what I had been doing, but it was all that I knew. And because that was
right,
the norm for, like, growing up, that's what you saw, that's what you learned, that's what you saw in the media, that's what you saw in movies. You saw the man was the
right,
strong one, the woman was the not she wasn't strong, but she was the softer version. So yeah, I think the way we can
yes,
start making change is, I guess, really just start holding each other, regardless, men and women, to a higher standard in how we are as leaders in our communities, as we are leaders in our companies, and how we treat each other there. I think it's gonna really start. to change how uh, this narrative can be changed to have more equality. It's going to take a lot longer. It's going to take a lot of work because we've had centuries of that was the way, and now we know this
Yeah.
is okay. We're living in a new century. We're living in, we have people, we're more, as though, I guess the word would be woke. They talk about being woke, where we're
Yes.
self-aware around things that we want to change, and
Yes.
that's a great thing. And like, I agree with you. If you're in a family dynamic where you have, this is the roles that you choose, that's great. I support that, as long as there's respect in the home, because I don't believe in like one person being the boss per se, and you
Correct.
feel like you're subordinate. It's having that, just, you
Right.
have roles that you've created for each other. The same for business. If you know I like the best, to me, the best business people are the ones who look to their employees, whether they're female or male, and what are their attributes, what's their character, what are their values, what are they bringing to the table, how are they interacting with each other as a team and supporting each other. That to me is where those traditional companies with the male in the leadership, or in the the ownership role, business owner. That's where, when I worked with companies like that, I felt, and still today feel, that that is where change can really start, is with those type of people who have that mindset. And that's kind of like the mindset. What I really love about the company that I support is, the managing partner, he leans on a lot of the women in his company, who are the lawyers in his company, to he trusts them, and he encourages them
Right.
to have a voice, and to, he looks to them for leadership. And that's what I think a true leader is, not just being the one who tells everyone what to do, but being open to being, open to new ideas, and implementing new ideas, even if they're not your own. And I think whether
Right.
you are male or female, wherever it comes from. So yeah, I love that. We are coming up to the top of the hour there, Andy.
We are so it's almost time for us to be wrapping up here pretty soon. I appreciate that, and I just wanted to call attention to a few of the things that you mentioned. Like it is, we can change this narrative by changing how we treat, like, the people we interact with on a daily basis, our own coworkers, our own bosses, our own people in our companies. I love that your boss treats the female warrior or the female lawyers the same. I don't know where warriors came from. Whatever. The female lawyers the same way that he treats the male ones. Right. That they all deserve a level of respect. And or maybe that's where that word came from, because lawyers do have to fight for us sometimes, and women are just as capable of doing that in the legal sense as men are. Um, and I like that that's the company you work for. It represents, like, where we work and how they treat us and our coworkers is representative of our own personality. It is representative of who we want to be. Um, I recently had someone say that they feel, kind of bad, because every time they start a new job, people get fired. They're involved in people getting fired, and I'm thinking, that's not a bad thing. If people were being toxic before, and you come into this new job and you happen to notice people being toxic, that doesn't necessarily mean that you caused them to be fired. It just means that you're the one who finally stood up and said something about it. Nobody else had the guts to. So for me, that's an admirable characteristic. It's let's start changing the companies we work for to be respectful to men and women equally. And to your point of holding people to a higher standard, that's not entirely my opinion, because I'm not so concerned whether or not we hold them to a higher standard. Just make sure it's the same standard. If you're going to have low standards for people, make sure it's the same low standards for men and women. If you're going to hold people to a higher standard, make sure it's the same higher standard for men and women. It's not to say that I don't think we should hold people to a higher standard. I just don't think everybody has that as a priority. I don't think everybody has that as a value. So those are the things that I really wanted to touch on. Of the words that you said, it really is about how we personally interact with men and women in a professional sense. And to touch on the cultural thing that you mentioned a little while ago, there is there is significant cultural differences. We here in North America have been trying to equalize men and women for several decades now, and to varying degrees of success. But a lot of the cultures around the world who are coming to North America, for many of them, this is a few years old, and maybe at most a couple of decades, right? But some of them, this is the first time coming to Canada or the States is the first time they've experienced these equal rights kind of things, and they don't get it, they don't agree with it, they don't like it. We can we can embrace those to my cultural compatriots, to my cultural friends and family and relatives. We can embrace those at the speed and level we feel most comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
The good thing I like about both the States and Canada is that we don't force you to into a certain timeline as to how you accept our values. We do expect you to accept our values at a certain point, but there isn't a specific, this many days in Canada and you have to accept us this way, and this many days in the States, or this many months, or this many years in our country, and this is how you have to act. There isn't that number. So what I want to offer is your own personal experience is valid. What you want, what you think you're capable of, and how what your personal situation is, all of that will have some influence on how quickly or slowly you can adapt to these equality changes. What I think you and I are trying to do with this conversation is really create an opportunity for change, not a demand for change. Let's just create the opportunity so more people know that it can happen so that we can actually let them go through it. Those are the things that I wanted to comment on what you had said. And since I took up so much time, I'll let you close out the show for us.
That's okay, Andy. You always bring value. No, I definitely agree with you. It's not necessarily holding them to a higher standard. It's just making sure that the standards are across the board the same for whether you're a woman or you're a
Yes.
man. But I think also it does, I still want to bring it back that it does start at home. It starts with our kids and, uh, teaching them that it really is about uh, how we speak to each other and being okay and open to allowing for each of us to have an equal voice that doesn't have a different standard set of rules attached to it because of I'm a woman or you're a man. So I think that's where it starts, and I
Mhm.
appreciate that we had this conversation today because it's definitely, I think, important that it's some, especially in this world we're living in, where we're seeing a lot of change, and women are starting to now, really start to support each other, stand up for each other, to create these opportunities for each other, and they have a lot of men in their corner, but I think really it's just changing the narrative in our own families and our own communities and the people that we interact with, and just holding ourselves to the same standards as we expect from others. So and not expecting someone to be better or than unless you're willing to hold yourself at that same standard. So I think that's important. I just
I
wanted to
agree.
close with that. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been awesome as always, and I definitely love the fact that we've had some interaction with one of our viewers who's been chiming in with questions and comments, and I think it's amazing. I hope that she got value today. Definitely, if you are just watching this back for the first time, maybe it's the first time that you've heard from Andy and myself, definitely take a look through our library. We've got a lot of topics that we've touched on based around business professionals and especially women in business, and starting to ask those questions. But we've got a couple of years also of other content that may be interesting to you. So go back and take a look. If you like what you're hearing, please subscribe so that you don't miss out when we go live, which is every Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern. And share it around. If you've got someone that you know that would really find value from listening to conversations like this, please be sure to share. This is uh, just to get the message out and get the conversation started. This is the reason why Andy and I started this YouTube channel. It was just to get the conversation started, to start helping you to think outside the box, to start asking questions, to start maybe pushing back on standards that you no longer believe in or maybe never believed in, but you went along for the ride. So being able to just be open. So appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming and watching us live or watching it back. We definitely are looking forward to next week, and we'll see you all again then. Have a great week. Andy, I hope you have an amazing week ahead as well. And do you have anything else to say before we close out?
Just thank you everybody for watching, and come on back next week for another great conversation. I'm sure we'll have one for you.
Sounds great. Thank you. All right. For that, we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.
See you everybody. Bye bye.